Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the Wild Rose scarf. So the first thing you'll need for this project is the free written pattern, which you can get by clicking the first link in the description box down below. And this is basically a very lightweight, one-size scarf. It's kind of narrow, not super long. It's a very lightweight, springy kind of accessory. And I'm using a fingering weight yarn. This is the Wild Rose colorway from Specktacular Yarns, and she sent me this yarn to review. I did a review on it several months ago, and now I'm going to go ahead and make a pattern with this yarn. So this is Wild Rose fingering. This is merino wool and nylon, and it's 100 gram skein. So you're going to need a good 100 gram skein of yarn for this, but that is not usually a problem because most beautiful hand-dyed yarns like this come in 100 gram skeins. So this is kind of my swatch or the stitch pattern that we'll be using for the scarf, and this is the exact same stitch pattern we used for the coral cardigan, except that we've added an edge stitch that we're going to be slipping the edge stitch just to keep a nice clean edge. So first you're going to need a 100 gram skein of fingering weight yarn. You'll also need a size 3 or 3.25 millimeter knitting needle. This is a circular knitting needle, and it needs to be a circular knitting needle because we're going to be knitting this scarf long ways. We're not going to start at one skinny end of the scarf and knit back and forth in shorter rows. We're going to start along the long side of the scarf and knit back and forth in very long rows. So you need enough room on your needle for a whole bunch of stitches to sit on there without being all scrunched up and falling off the needles. So this is a rather long circular needle, and it is a US size 3 or 3.25 millimeter. So you'll also need some scissors and a yarn needle to weave in your ends. And once we're finished, we will also need some blocking mats and pins to block the scarf. But if you're using a different type of yarn that is not a natural fiber, then you might want to use steam blocking. I have a whole video on blocking, and I will refer to that when we get there. So that is what we're going to need for this project, so let's get started with the knitting. Alright, so now that we have our yarn and our needles and everything, we can start by casting on. So I'm going to be using the knitted on cast on for this. And so I'm going to start by making a slip knot and placing it on my left needle. And then I'm going to go ahead and tension the yarn as if I were going to start knitting with it, because we are. And what I'm going to do for the knitted on cast on, since this slip knot counts as my first stitch, I'm going to insert my needle into that stitch, knit through it, and then lift it up and place it back on the needle knitwise so that my needles are going into it as if I was knitting into that stitch. Then I'm going to knit through the stitch that I just put on the needles, stretch it, lift it up, and then bring it back down on the needle so that my needles are going through it as if to knit. Then I'm going to knit through that, stretch it up, bring it back down onto the needle, so my needles are going through it as if to knit, knit through that, lift that new stitch up, slide it back down on the left needle, and so on, until I have enough stitches for my scarf. So for this particular scarf, we're going to be casting on a total of 350 stitches onto our needles, and then we will begin knitting. So I'm going to go ahead and keep doing this knitted on cast on, where then I'm going to knit through the stitch, lift up the new loop, and bring it down. And as I bring it down, I want my right needle and my left needle to both be pointing up. I brought it down onto the left needle. Now I can knit through it again. So I'm knitting through the new loop, bringing the new loop down, knitting through that new loop, and then bring another loop down and knit through that. And I'm going to keep doing that until I have a total of 350 stitches on my needle. Alright, so I have cast on my 350 stitches, and it might look kind of short right now, but these stitches are all bunched up on the length of my needle. And once this comes off the needle, it will be longer because it won't be bunched up. It will be able to lay flat. But this is why it's important to check your gauge, just to make sure that your scarf will come out to the right size, and to make sure that your yarn will actually last you through the whole project. So now that we've cast on all of our stitches, we can move on to row 1. Alright, so for row 1, we are going to slip the first stitch purlwise. So I'm going to insert my needle into that stitch as if I were going to purl it, but I'm not going to purl it. I'm just going to slip it off onto my right needle. Alright, so I've slipped the first stitch. Now I'm going to knit a stitch, and then I'm going to knit 1, purl 1 all the way across until I have 2 stitches left in my row. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and I'm going to keep doing that knit 1, purl 1 until I have 2 stitches left in my row. Alright, I've got 2 stitches left on my needle, and now I'm going to knit those last 2 stitches. So that is the end of row 1. So now let's move on to row 2. So for row 2, I'm going to bring my yarn to the front and slip that first stitch as if to purl. Then I'm going to knit the second stitch in my row. And now I'm going to purl 1, knit 1 all the way across until I have 2 stitches left in the row. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, all the way across till there are 2 stitches left. Alright, I've got 2 stitches left, and again I'm going to knit those last 2 stitches in my row. So that is the end of row 2. So now what we're going to do is for rows 3 and 4, we're just going to repeat rows 1 and 2. So we worked row 1 and row 2. Now for row 3, we're going to repeat row 1, and for row 4, we're going to repeat row 2. So I'm going to work rows 1 and 2 another time for rows 3 and 4, and then we'll move on to row 5. Alright, so I've finished rows 3 and 4, and now we're ready to move on and work row 5. So row 5 is one of the easiest rows in this pattern. We're just going to slip the first stitch as if to purl. Then we're going to knit every stitch across. So we're just going to knit every single stitch all the way across the entire row. Alright, there's the end of row 5. And now for row 6, we're just going to slip the first stitch as if to purl. Then we're going to knit 1 stitch, and then we're going to purl every stitch across until we have 2 stitches left in our row. Alright, so I've got 2 stitches left in my row, and I'm going to go ahead and knit those last 2 stitches. So that is the end of row 6. Now for rows 7 and 8, we're going to repeat rows 5 and 6. Alright, so I've finished working rows 7 and 8, and now we're going to do rows 9 to 10. And for rows 9 to 10, we're going to repeat rows 1 and 2. And then for rows 11 and 12, we're going to repeat rows 5 to 6. So I'm going to work row 1, then row 2, then row 5, then row 6 again. And then we'll move on to row 13. Alright, so now we're ready to move on to row 13 of this stitch pattern. And what we're going to do is we are going to create a row of eyelets. And eyelets are just little holes, intentional holes in the fabric that we get when we make yarn overs and decreases to go with it. So for every yarn over, you should have a decrease that goes with it so that you're not adding stitches, because we're not actually making this wider. So when we work a yarn over, we need to work a decrease stitch with it to compensate for the fact that we just added a stitch by making a yarn over. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and slip the first stitch as if to purl. Then we're going to bring the yarn to the back. We're going to knit 1, and then we're going to knit 2 together, yarn over. And we're going to repeat that across to the last 2 stitches. So we're going to knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, across to the last 2 stitches. So for a knit 2 together, instead of inserting the needle as if to knit into 1 stitch, we're going to insert the needle as if to knit into the next 2 stitches and knit through both of them at once. And then for the yarn over, we're just basically taking that right needle tip and bringing it behind the working yarn. And that creates our little eyelet. You can kind of see right there on that first one that now that we have created that knit 2 together, yarn over, the yarn over right there is creating a little hole. And that's what makes the eyelets or the lace in this fabric. So again, I'm going to come up here and insert my needle into 2 stitches at once as if to knit, and knit through both of them together. That's the knit 2 together. And then I'm going to yarn over. Then I'm going to knit 2 together and yarn over. So I'm going to keep repeating that knit 2 together, yarn over sequence until I have 2 stitches left in my row. Alright, so I've got 2 stitches left in my row, and I'm going to knit those last 2 stitches. So now we can turn and work row 14, which is just to repeat row 6. So for row 14, we're going to repeat row 6, and for rows 15 and 16, we're going to repeat rows 5 to 6. So I'm going to go ahead and work row 6, row 5, and then row 6 again for rows 14, 15, and 16, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, so I have finished working those rows, and now what we're going to do, this is what our piece looks like at this point. Now we're going to repeat rows 3 to 16 3 more times. So I'm going to work rows 3 to 16 again, then I'm going to work rows 3 to 16 again, and then I'm going to work rows 3 to 16 again. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat all of those rows, and then I will show you what it looks like at that point and what we're going to do next. Alright, so we finished working rows 3 to 16 3 more times, and now we're going to work rows 3 to 8 1 more time, and then we're going to work rows 1 to 4 1 more time. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat rows 3 to 8 and then repeat rows 1 to 4, and then I'll show you how we're going to bind off. Alright, so now that I've finished repeating all the rows for the scarf and we've done all of the actual knitting, now we're going to go ahead and bind off. So to bind off, we're just going to use a regular bind off, but we're going to work it kind of loosely. So we're going to go ahead and knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one. So then we can go ahead and knit another stitch and pass the first stitch over the second one. And as you do this loosely, you want to make sure that your loop is always stretched out on the needle so you can kind of see the gap through the loop, where that it is not sitting snugly up against the needle, but it's got a little bit of room in it. So I'm going to just use my index finger to hold on to that so that it doesn't get tightened up. Then I can knit the next stitch, making sure there's also a gap in that stitch, and pass the first stitch over the second one. And by leaving a little gap in each stitch, that helps us keep our bind off on the looser side so that it does not inhibit the stretch of the edge, and so that it doesn't make it too hard to pull the loops over each other. So I'm going to continue across, binding off loosely by making sure each stitch is kind of stretched, knitting the next stitch, and passing the first one over the second one, knit the next stitch, make sure it's stretched, and pass the first stitch over the second one. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way across until I've bound off all the stitches in my row. Alright, so now I am down to the last stitch that's on my needle. So now I'm going to leave a tail about 8 inches long, and I'm going to go ahead and cut the yarn tail. So now all that's left to do is stretch the loop on the needle until the end of the yarn comes out, and just tug on it a little bit to tighten. We are done with the knitting needles now. So before we add fringe, obviously just by looking at this you can realize that it is curled up a little bit. This fabric does not curl as strongly as just straight stockinette stitch, but it does have some kind of fold to it on the stockinette stitch sections in between. So what we're going to do next is block our scarf. And if you're not familiar with blocking, I do have a whole video explaining how to block your knitting. And blocking is just a way of getting the fabric to relax into its most natural state. So for this particular yarn, it is a wool yarn, and so I'm going to go ahead and wet block my scarf, which means I'm just going to get it all wet, gently squeeze out any excess water, and then I'm going to pin it out onto some foam blocking mats and let it dry, and that will help relax the fabric and get it to lay flat and smooth. It will also help open up the eyelets a bit more so that you can really see that lace stitch pattern. And so I'm going to go ahead and block my scarf. If you are not familiar with blocking, like I said, I have a whole video on blocking your knitting, and I'll link that down below in the description box. So I'm going to go block my scarf, and then once my scarf is totally dry, then we'll come back and do the fringe. Alright, so my scarf has been fully blocked, it's been pinned out, and it has dried completely, so I've gone ahead and removed it from the blocking mats. So the last step here is to add the fringe. Now, of course, fringe is always kind of an optional thing, but if you want to add the fringe, then keep watching, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. So you can see how that now that we've blocked our scarf, it has a very, very pretty drape to it, which is something that is one of the pros of working with fingering weight yarn, because it's so lightweight, and when you're using it with an open stitch like this, it has very pretty drape to it. And now that we've blocked it, the scarf lays nice and flat and smooth, and it does not curl up. So we're going to add some fringe to the ends of our scarf. So I have a crochet hook here that I'm going to use for this, but if you want to, you can use a yarn needle to get the fringe strands poked through the stitches on the edge of the scarf. But I personally find a crochet hook a little bit more handy for this. This is a 2.5mm crochet hook. So I'm going to go ahead and move this scarf out of the way for right now. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to use this ruler to measure out lengths of yarn. So you want to cut your pieces of yarn twice as long as you want your fringe to be. So I think I'm going to go for fringe that's about 5 inches long, so I'm going to cut my lengths of yarn at 10 inches long. So I'm going to unroll my yarn here, and I'm just going to pull out some yarn. And when we do this, we don't want to be like stretching it super long or like, you know, pulling it taut, because we just want it to lay naturally. So I'm going to measure that out at 10 inches and cut a length of yarn. And we're going to do this as many times as we need to until we have enough fringe yarn for the entire edge of our scarf. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut like maybe the first 5 here on camera so that you can watch how I'm going to attach them to the scarf, because I like to kind of cut them as I go and then just see how many more I need as I'm going along. So I'm just going to cut a couple more here. All right, there we go. And I'm just going to show you how we're going to attach the first few pieces. So here is the end of my scarf. It obviously already has 2 strands of fringe from the yarn tails, which we are not going to weave in because they will count as part of our fringe. So I'm going to take one of these strands of yarn and I'm going to fold it in half so that the ends of the yarn are together, and I'm kind of making a half mark at the top where I am going to grab it with my hook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come along here to the edge of the scarf, and if you remember that we slipped a stitch at the beginning of every row, that makes a very neat edge here where you can see that there are smooth stitches that are very neat. They're not like kind of knotted as a lot of times the edge would look if we did not slip the first stitch of every row. So I'm just going to insert my crochet hook into one of those stitches. It has a front strand and a back strand. If you're familiar with crochet, it looks a lot like the top of a regular crochet stitch. And I'm going to take my crochet hook and grab that halfway mark in my yarn and pull that through. So now that I have that loop pulled through, I'm going to grab both strands of my fringe with my hook and pull both strands of the fringe through the loop that was on my hook, and then just kind of tug on it a little bit to tighten. So that is the first strand of fringe there. So then I'm going to take another length of yarn, fold it in half so that the ends are matching up, and then find the halfway point. And then I'm going to come over here to the scarf and insert my hook into the stitch right next to the one I just did. Grab that halfway point of the yarn, and then I'm going to go ahead and I pulled up a new loop of the half folded line of the yarn for the fringe. Now I'm going to grab the tails of the fringe and pull them through the loop. And I would like to recommend that when you do this, you always insert your hook in the same direction on the scarf. So I'm always inserting my hook from the wrong side of the work to the right side of the work. And if you want to do it the other way, that's fine, and insert it this way. But the point being, you want to just be consistent with which direction that you are inserting the hook, because that will change a little bit the way that it looks right here at the top where we've kind of knotted it on there. So another thing you can do is just while you're holding the scarf, insert your hook into the next stitch and then just kind of set it down and lay it there while you grab the next length of yarn. Then of course we're going to fold it in half and grab that halfway point with our hook, pull it through the stitch, and then grab the yarn tails with the hook and pull them totally through that loop. So that is how we're going to be attaching our fringe, and I'm basically going to go along and put a strand of the fringe, a length of this yarn, into each stitch across the edge. If you wanted a thicker fringe, you could work with 2 strands of fringe at the same time by taking 2 lengths of yarn like this and then folding them in half. And you could do that. But I am going for a thinner, more delicate fringe for this particular scarf because it is a more delicate type of piece. But if you wanted a thicker fringe, then you could use double strands for each stitch and do it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and continue adding fringe to both ends of my scarf, and then I'll show you what it looks like. Alright, so on this end of my scarf, I've just got one little piece of fringe left to add, but I just wanted to show you a little trick that can help make sure your yarn tails on the corners of your scarf kind of get included with your fringe instead of sticking off to the side like this one is trying to do. So what I'm going to do is the last stitch that I need to put fringe in right there is the same place that my yarn tail is coming from. It's the very last one on the corner. So here is my folded piece of yarn. So I'm going to pick the scarf up and insert my hook into that very last stitch, and I'm going to pull up the loop of the folded yarn, and then I'm just going to grab that yarn tail, hold it together with my fringe tails, and grab all 3 of those strands and pull them through the previous loop. And when I tighten that, that kind of includes the tail as a part of that last cluster of fringe right there. So once you've got fringe on both ends of your scarf, I would recommend, it's not required, but I recommend steaming your fringe. And as you can see, this fringe right here is kind of wiggly, and that's probably because it is the yarn from the center of the skein, and it has been kind of all crunched up inside the center of the skein for a while. So I recommend steaming your fringe, which will kind of relax any kinks in the yarn. And then after we steam the fringe, we can go ahead and just trim it straight across the bottom to make sure that our yarn tails from the corners are even with the rest of the fringe, and to make sure that there aren't really any little fringe ends that are sticking out past the rest of the fringe. So that will help us get a straight, clean, even fringe edge if we steam the fringe first and then go ahead and trim it. So I'm going to go ahead and steam my fringe by holding a steam iron just a couple inches over the surface of the yarn and just kind of letting the steam penetrate the yarn. But if you have like a handheld garment steamer, you can do that as well and just kind of let the steam penetrate through the yarn, and that will help relax the fringe. And you can also kind of comb it out with your fingers to stretch the kinks out if you need to as you're steaming. Alright, so now that my scarf has all its fringe and the fringe is trimmed neatly, now my scarf is finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.